Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Dr. Craig Burnside, biology professor in the life science department at Tarrant County College Southeast Campus, which is located in Texas between Dallas and Fort Worth. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a project I undertook in the fall of 2024. We're here at Tarrant County College. We call this a faculty development leave, and a lot of places call it a sabbatical. And what that is an opportunity for a faculty member to write a proposal with whatever crazy idea they have that they want to go off and study by themselves for themselves. So I wrote said proposal, and it was about a year in the making. I submitted it, and it was approved. Thank you for everybody who helped in that process. I appreciate that. And what I'm going to do now is tell you the first part of a four-part series of what I did while I was on my faculty development leave. So let's go to the PowerPoint. So along the way with the teaching science for all the years that I have, I kind of wondered why it was we were talking about certain people hundreds of years later. What was it about these people and their lives that allowed them to see and discover and describe things that others had missed? Because at these times that these three pioneers that I've talked about, Andreas Vesalius is known as the father of anatomy, bringing anatomy into the modern sciences 500 years ago. Charles Darwin, natural selection, and Gregor Mendel, who discovered the mechanisms of genetics, they were all working in very competitive times. There were other people that were working on these topics, trying desperately to be the first, because they all knew if they were the first, we'd be talking about them today. And I decided I wanted to see, but my question is, why them? And I realized that for the reason is that they viewed their world through a unique set of experiences that went back all the way before they were born, where they were born, their childhood, and all the experiences they had after that. So my proposal was to study these three founders of biological sciences and visit their birthplace, where they grew up, where they went to college, where they worked, anything else I could find out about them, and then visit their final resting place and contemplate their existence. So let's go on my journey. Like I said, this is the first one of a four-part series. It took me to Europe for 2 months. I know that's terrible. I spent, my mouse, the cursor doesn't work. There it is. So I spent the first part in England with studying Charles Darwin. You might say, what's the difference between England or what all the other places that I've heard of? England is a country. The Great Britain includes Wales and Scotland, and the United Kingdom includes Northern Ireland. So I flew into London. As soon as I was approved, I was really excited. I bought myself a plane ticket, a really cheap plane ticket, which was, I couldn't adjust anything. 2 months, I was there. So I went about different places in England. I then went down to northern Italy and spent some time in northern Italy. Then I went to France and met my daughter. And I'll tell you, this is going to be the fourth part of the series. My daughter is working on a graduate degree at the University of Texas at Dallas in Holocaust history. And I realized I was going to have some time. So she came over, and we spent 2 weeks going through Germany, up through the Czech Republic, in Prague, Warsaw, down to Krakow. She left. I went into the Czech Republic to study Mendel. And then I got done, and I had a little bit of extra time. I was trying to figure out what to do, so I got on a train and took a week and went across Austria to Switzerland, ended up in Geneva, and made my way to Amsterdam before I made it home. That's a rough life, I know. So let's get started here. The first one, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809, which was quite a day for human history. There's somebody else that was born on that same exact date, not just February 12th, but February 12th, 1809. And in my classes, I asked, does anybody know who that is? And very rarely somebody comes up with the answer, Abraham Lincoln. So February 12th, 1809, quite a significant day for humanity. He was born in a little town called Shrewsbury, which is in central England. And as you can see, there's a plaque at his house. It's called the Mount because it's a nice house and it's built up on a hill. This is a statue of Charles Darwin at the Natural History Museum in Oxford. And you'll see throughout the series that anytime I could find a statue of my guys, I took a picture. I had somebody take a picture of me with the statue. Here we'll find out that at the very end, he passed away, of course, like the fate that awaits us all. He was 71 years old, and he is interred at Westminster Abbey. So we'll get to that at the very end. So my trip through England, the Charles Darwin's life, I didn't do this in chronological order of his life, but Shrewsbury is right here, a little tiny town in central England. He was born there. He then went to college up at Edinburgh, which is outside up above the picture here. Then he went to Cambridge, and then he met the Beagle for his famous voyage down here at Portsmouth. He went off for 5 years. He came back, went back to London for a while, got married, and built himself a house in a little town outside of London called Down. I did not take this picture. Most of the pictures in this presentation I took, this is off the Chamber of Commerce from Shropshire, which is the county that Shrewsbury is. I didn't take this picture either. I took a bunch of pictures, but none of them this good. And Shrewsbury is just a wonderful little town. I loved it there. I told my wife, I said, I could just call for you to bring the dogs over and we could stay here. Nice little city. But before we get into that, spoiler alert. We know that Charles Darwin, he came up and described the theory of natural selection. And so what exactly is that? So let's talk about that for just a second so that we can see this as we view his experiences that led him to describe natural selection. So the definition of evolution I give in my biology classes is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. And there's some important parts of that definition. A population is a group of individuals, all the same species. And so an individual cannot evolve. An individual is born with their genetic composition, and that's it. But the population can evolve. This is a picture of two forms of the peppered moth found in England. You see it has a white or light color form and a dark color form. Back in the early 1800s in England, the white color form dominated. It was about 98% of the population, and the dark colored form was very rare. Because the moth rests on trees that, okay, there we go, covered with a light colored lichen. And as you can see on the left here, the light colored moth blends in really well. Dark colored moth stands out. And the birds that prey on this species, if you're a bird and you're flying around, you're looking for something to eat, bam, the dark colored form stands right out and you eat it. And that's what kept their numbers low in that population. I might add that the color of the moth is genetic and not influenced by the environment. Well, in the mid-1850s, when the Industrial Revolution came around, at the time they were powering their factories with coal-fired power plants that just let the effluent just go into the atmosphere without any modification. And it had all kinds of nasty stuff in it, especially soot, which made the trees become dark. It killed off the light-colored lichens, and the trees were dark. And then now all of a sudden the environment has changed. Instead of having the moths live in a light-colored environment and have an advantage, the dark moth now has an advantage. On the right side, you can see how well the dark moth blends in, and the white moth stands out, and so they got preyed upon, and the population genetics completely switched to where the moth was 90%, the dark-colored moth was 90%, and the light-colored moth was only about 10%. Well, then come around back to the around 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where technology existed and the desire existed to clean up the effluent from power plants. And the lichens grew back and the trees got light again, and the population went right back to where it was in the early 1800s. And so there's just one example of where we've observed and measured the change of a genetic makeup of a population, in this case over 150 years. Now, also, scientists are just people like everybody else. We have opinions. We don't like to change them. And there's a concept called the paradigm shift. Paradigm is a way of thinking. And sometimes these paradigm shifts happen very slowly, and a lot of evidence has to build up before people will say, okay, well, I'm going to think in this new way. And in the mid 1700s, it was starting to be obvious from the information from geology, the fossil record, that life has changed over time. And they called this organic evolution. And it was starting to be okay to think about that. Up until then, the only way to talk about it was one creation event, or each species was an individual creation event from divinely created. And in the 1750s, there was a guy, a Frenchman named Georges Buffon, who wrote a series of books promoting the idea of evolution. The church told him not to do that, and he said, okay, I'm sorry, and then he kept doing it. And then fast forward to the late 1700s, and even Charles Darwin's grandfather, was investigating evolution. And the very first proposal of how it would work, we're looking for a mechanism, meaning this is how, it's not just that it happened, but how, was by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, another Frenchman. You can see the time frame where he lived. He came out with his theory of acquired characteristics. And under his theory, he said an organism can acquire certain traits during their lifetime and pass those off to their offspring. And he made an example of a blacksmith pounding his hammer on an anvil day after day, would bulk up on the right side of his shoulder and pass that off to his son. Now, of course, we know that today that's not wrong. That's not correct. And one of his other examples was giraffes. This is a biology presentation, so here's my token fuzzy animal. That giraffes would stretch their necks to reach parts of the trees where the leaves were still there, and that they're not understanding genetics or how any of that worked. They had this term for body fluids called humors, and as he said, as the giraffe's neck stretches, the humors fill in, and that the prevailing theory of inheritance at the time was blending, and that each part of the organism would send information to the sperm or egg how to make that organism. And in this case, the giraffe's neck would send information to the sperm or egg on how to create a giraffe with a longer neck, and that over the eons, that it would end up with having animals with longer necks. Now, we know that's not true, and that does not make Lamarck or anybody else that adhered to that theory that they were wrong, but they were trying. They were very smart people. I mean, 200 years later, talking about Lamarck. Charles Darwin at first adhered to the teachings or theories of Lamarck. So now we go back to Darwin's family. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. This is a personal thing for me. When I defended my master's thesis, after 2 hours of questions from the faculty, the very last question was, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather? And I looked at the guy and I said, I don't know, Mr. Darwin. And he said his name was Dr. Erasmus Darwin. Come see me on Monday. And that's where I heard first about Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was a physician in central England, and he was very successful, and he was very eclectic in his pursuits. He was a poet. He wrote a lot of poetry. He was also wrote a book about evolution called Zoonomia. And so he died before Charles passed away, but I mean, he passed away before Charles was born. But this is the type of family that Darwin was born into. At that time, there was a range of people, of course, but there were some religious extremes, and there was some families where it was okay to talk about these topics. And Darwin certainly was born into and raised in a family where it was okay to talk about evolution. Heck, his grandfather wrote a book about it before he was born. Robert Darwin, the physician, was also a very successful doctor in Shrewsbury, and he seemed like a really interesting character. Charles Darwin liked him very much. He said he was the largest man he'd ever seen. He's just 6'2", probably about 300 pounds. And he was very wealthy, and the family was very well off. And then also his other grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood I. This picture is of his uncle Josiah. He comes into the story a little bit later. Created a dinnerware company, pottery company that was very, very successful. He pioneered a lot of new techniques in staining and ceramics, and he was also very rich. And so Darwin was a lucky guy, a very lucky guy. Machiavelli used to call being lucky, he called it fortuna, as in fortune. And he said fortune would smile upon certain people, and fortuna certainly smiled upon Charles Darwin. His father and two of his grandfathers were certified geniuses, so he's got a pretty good gene pool to work with. And here's the house where Charles was born. Now, all the research I did before I left indicated to me that this was privately owned, private property. I said, well, I have to go to Shrewsbury anyway. That's where he went to school, and there's other things I need to do in Shrewsbury. So I walk my way up the driveway, and I step back and I take this picture, and I see the plaque on the front door. So I can see what it says, realizing I'm trespassing, and but I didn't go all that way to not go there. So I go up to the front door, and it opens, and I thought, oh no, I wonder what the penalty is for trespassing here. And it turned out it was a guy named John Hughes, and he was the UK government representative trying to restore and turn the Mount into a museum, and he ended up giving me a 3-hour private tour. If you ever see this, John, thank you very much. So it was actually quite fascinating. Nice house with a large yard, and there's a room that Charles Darwin was born in. From the outside, it's this room. This room was the exam room. This is where the kids were born. This was Dr. Roberts' study. Over here was a library and a family room in there, and the living quarters up on the second floor. And there was also 4 servants over here, and they had nice servants. So Charles was born in that room. It was kind of cool standing right there. And I got a couple of pictures that I took in there. So Charles's father, Robert, was a very large man, and he built a special carriage that he couldn't get into. So they had these special stones made so that he could get up into the carriage, and it had extra good suspension so that he had a little library and a writing desk, and as he went on his rounds, as doctors did back in the day, he could continue with his studies and his writing and his reading. This is the church that the family went to, the Unitarian church there in Shrewsbury. Right down the hill to the left of this picture is a little pond. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And the Darwin family went to church because that's what you did. Socially, you could not go to church, really. And Darwin didn't really ever mind going to church. His family is described as being skeptical to maybe agnostic, which was a word that hadn't been invented at the time, to maybe even atheist. But Charles didn't mind going to church, and that's another factor of him growing up in his life. Had he grown up in a strict fundamentalist interpretation, he maybe it's not okay to talk about evolution. It's not okay to talk about anything having to do with other than a strict interpretation of the Bible. And so that upbringing certainly framed how he looked at the world. Another thing that happened that framed the way he looked at the world was this fellow Joseph Priestley. He is discoverer of oxygen, and also he was a rabble-rouser who wrote letters against the establishment, against the king, against the church. And he was going to give a talk in Manchester, which is just a little bit north of Shrewsbury, when he got word that maybe he shouldn't go. And so you can imagine that his feeling of writing something that could be, there we go, thank you, interpreted as being, heretical, really influenced how he thought about making his publication, his final publication on the the famous one on the origin of species by means of natural selection. This priestly event haunted him throughout his entire life. This is the day school he went to, a primary school. He went there for a couple of years with his younger sister. He had a good time there. He describes himself as saying that, I think my teachers would describe me as just an ordinary boy who liked to get into a lot of mischief. This is the Shrewsbury school, very famous and at one point one of the best schools in all of England. This is where he went. It was a boarding school, so he lived there. But his house on the mount was only about a mile away. And he used to go over there, go home and visit his sisters and his mom and hang out at the house. And then he would always leave a little bit late and had to run back before he would get in trouble back at the school. And he said that I would run and I was lucky and I would be praying the whole way. And sometimes I would make it. And I attributed that to my prayers, which doesn't really jive with the agnostic part, but he was very young there. And you can see right there's a statue erected to commemorate Shrewsbury's favorite son. So you probably know what's next. There's a picture of your hero. Sporting a really nice raincoat, aren't I? That raincoat was one of the gifts that the district gave us one year, beginning of a semester, and it is absolutely fantastic. I used it a lot in England. If you look at the base of the statue has some creatures that are famous from his trip to the Galapagos Islands. We have the marine turtle. There's a finch up there. Darwin's finches are real famous for what he saw. I'll tell you about that, what he saw when he got to those islands. Another thing he said, he enjoyed the time at Shrewsbury School, but it was entirely wasted. That's a theme, is that he thought his education was just, he never really learned anything. Of course, we know that's different, but sometimes the attitudes of students are different when they're a student than when they are a little bit later. At the back to the mount, there was what they call the doctor's walk, and the property is now chopped up. It's not original like it was, but his father would take long walks, which kind of makes me wonder how he could be such a large guy. And so John Hughes told me, he said, you wanted to go down the doctor's walk and just go out the driveway, take a right. It's just a little ways there. You'll see like a little gate with some brick walls. And I looked at that and I was like, no, do I really want to go through that? Now what? But I did. And it opened up into some beautiful scenery. I walked down those stairs and you can see the river Severn off in the distance right there. It's the river that goes right through Shrewsbury. And you can walk along the river. It was actually really beautiful. There was some sculling or crew, people rowing boats from the day school up and down the river while I was there. And I couldn't go the rest of the way. It's a locked gate and private property. But it was interesting to walk the same walk that Robert Darwin would have walked, and Charles probably tag along every once in a while. It was really sort of special to actually be there to see it. There's a story about this rock here down in the lower right called the Bellstone. And it's a rather large and unusual rock. It's a granite rock, and there's no granite anywhere near Shrewsbury. The nearest granite is up in Scotland. And Darwin, there was a fella in town who Darwin heard say, the world will certainly end before anybody can explain how this rock got here. And a couple of years later, Darwin was reading a paper on transportation of rocks by glaciers and icebergs. The Bellstone, went off in his head. Oh, that's how it got here. So he actually traced that guy down and explained it to him. He said in his autobiography, I contemplated and meditated over that rock for many hours. And Charles was the kind of guy who liked to catch frogs. He would spend hours and hours. This is just down the hill from the church in beautiful park today. And he would spend hours and hours collecting frogs, catching salamanders. He was particularly interested in beetles and botany. There's a story about how he collected beetles, and he saw one that he hadn't seen before, and he grabbed it. And then he saw another one he hadn't seen before, and he grabbed it. And then he saw a third that he had never seen before. Now what's he going to do? So he put the one beetle in his mouth and grabbed the third one, and he said, the beetle in my mouth released just a horrible substance that made me spit it out and let go of the other two, and so he ended up with no beetles. But he was the kind of kid who would come home, literally come home for dinner with a frog in his pocket. A beautiful little park down there today. This is a very odd piece of work here. It's called the Three Pillars. It's erected to Charles Darwin in Shrewsbury. I wouldn't have known it was there had Mr. Hughes not told me about it. But the three pillars of Darwin's existence were geology. He was trained in geology. He hated geology at first, but then he came to love it. His faith, or kind of lack or weak thereof, and gardening. They had extensive gardens at the Mount, and greenhouses, and even a hothouse where they grew tropical plants. And the Darwin children, Charles, his brothers and sisters, all were involved in the gardening, and they all had responsibilities. They had plants that they needed to maintain and keep records over. There was one flowering plant that Charles was responsible for, where one of his jobs was to count how many flowers came out of it each spring. And so he noted that, well, there was only about 50 in the first year, and then it was 150 the second year, and then it took off to like 350 the third year. And Darwin once said about being a naturalist that if anybody had been prepared to be a naturalist in their youth, it would have been him. And so now we see another way that he viewed the world, the natural world, from a very young age. And also a little bit more fortuna. This is a statue by what was the library, and of course with your heroes in there. So Shrewsbury's favorite son, he gets ready to go off to college. Now this is not hard to figure out. Charles's grandfather was a physician. Charles's father was a physician. And in the 1820s, guess what? Does Charles get to go off to college and pick his major? Not really. His father said, you know what, you're going to go to Edinburgh and you're going to study medicine. And his brother was already there. Charles didn't want to study medicine. And he was really disgusted by blood. He went to an operation that he just found was disgusting. There was no anesthesia back in that day. It was the times before chloroform, such that he ran out of the room. Now, how well do you do when you're studying something that you don't love? You're being forced to study something, and it's difficult. Medicine's not easy. As a matter of fact, one of the things Darwin said about his time in Edinburgh was, he said he hated the anatomy lectures, and that the anatomy lectures were just as boring as the professor giving them. And I thought, well, I hope my students don't think that. So he failed out, didn't do well. Robert Darwin pulls his son out of Edinburgh and he comes home. Now you're in your carriage, because you don't have to walk. You're not on a horseback. You're in a carriage. You pull up to the driveway here. You know your dad is in here waiting on you. That's an uncomfortable situation, isn't it? And I asked Mr. Hughes, I said, I've been trying to find out where this conversation took place and what it entailed. And I said, I thought, if there's anybody who knows, it's going to be him. And he didn't. There's not really a record of it. So I kind of have to imagine it in my mind what happened. And that's not too difficult, because something similar happened to me one time. And I had to have an uncomfortable conversation with my father too. So I imagine that, and you got to get off the carriage and get inside, because you know you got to go see the old man, and the longer you wait, the worse it's going to be. So I imagine that he went in, and John said it was probably, if it's a private discussion, it was probably over here in the study. You walk in the door and say, Father. Then he finally looks up and says, Charles, what are we going to do with you? Are you ever going to become a productive member of society? You seem to be only good for sports and catching rats. And Charles Darwin loved the shooting sports. Shooting was one of his big passions. He said, so what are we going to do with you? And Charles was like, well, back in the day, when you took a swing at a miss, or the second son, or you took a swing at a miss, the clergy was the next option. And so Charles's father said, I think I'll send you to Cambridge to study theology. Now, Charles didn't want to say, well, I'd rather study biology, because there was no biology degree at the time. If you wanted to study the creation as they described it, then your field was natural theology. You went and described the natural theology. You went and described God's creation. And Charles said, can I think about it for a minute? And his father said, yes, but you know how that went. So Charles goes off as a backup plan to Christ's College in Cambridge. And this is just one of the great buildings in Cambridge, a beautiful college city. And so now he's there and he's studying theology, which he says that I never had any inclination toward being a clergyman, but this is what I had to do. And it was allowed him to interact with the natural history faculty there and start learning what we would call today biology and become a naturalist. This is the building that he lived in. That's the door to his dorm room, but it was locked. I couldn't get inside. And in the second floor, this is the window of his bedroom. And one of the things he liked to do was he liked to take his shotgun and throw it up in the mirror to make sure he had good aim. Evidently, he was a very good shot. And back in those days, the type of rifle they had, the hammer would fall onto a small blasting cap and then cause the black powder in the barrel to ignite. And so he had a friend who would have a candle and move the candle around the house, and he would draw up and fire a cap to see if he could blow the window out. And the tutor, as it's described, as Cambridge College would say, Mr. Darwin is actually a fancy person. I think he has a horsewhip in his room, because often when I walk underneath his windows, I can hear it crack. Well, he was just up there horsing around. He was also from a very wealthy family. He would have the local boys choir come and sing at his parties, and which he liked shooting and he liked parties, and somehow or another he managed to do well at Cambridge. And yes, there's a statue at Cambridge of our hero, and there I am sporting my team colors, my Tarrant County Southeast jacket, Life Science Department. It was one of the interesting things was getting people to take these pictures. That was an interesting challenge. All right, so Darwin does really well and distinguishes himself amongst his peers at Cambridge. He goes back home after he graduates, and in the meantime, there's this fella here, Robert Fitzroy, captain in the British Navy. And his boat, we have a picture of that coming right up, the H.M.S. Beagle, was getting set to go do a tour of the South American coast and make maps. Now, militarily speaking, the better maps you have, the better advantage you have. You can find a safe harbor if you can know maybe where your enemy is hiding. There's many advantages to having really good maps. And so it was peacetime. So this is like about late 1820s. And Fitzroy realizes that, and it's common in peacetime, to bring along a gentleman friend to share at his table. Being a captain and having life or death over your sailors and your officers is a lonely existence. And the previous captain of the Beagle had succumbed to that and committed suicide. And so in the time, a gentleman had a very precise definition. It was somebody who was well-trained, well-mannered, and came from a wealthy background. So Fitzroy said, you know what, I think that there'd be a good opportunity for somebody to come and come with me and share my table. So he proposed that to Captain Beaufort, who was in charge of that department at the Royal Navy, and Beaufort agreed. So Beaufort sent a letter to Professor Henslow, famous naturalist, and there was a little bit of an intermediate there. Henslow didn't directly get the letter, who said, they said, hey, can you help us find somebody who would fit this description? And Henslow was very famous. Darwin was like attached to him at his hip, such that Darwin's reputation was the man that walks with Henslow, because he followed him around everywhere. And so Henslow said, I've got your guy. Henslow wrote a letter to Darwin that was delivered at the Mount, and Darwin reads the letter. Now, I'm going to read you the letter in my best/worst English accent, which my British friend tells me is terrible. During the summer of 1831, Captain Fitzroy foresaw that the next Beagle voyage would present an ideal opportunity for collecting specimens of natural history. In his narrative of the Beagle voyage, Fitzroy wrote, anxious that no opportunity of collecting useful information during the voyage should be lost, I propose to the hydrographer, Captain Francis Beaufort, that some well-educated and scientific person should be sought for whom would willingly share such accommodation as I had to offer in order to profit by the opportunity of visiting distant countries yet little known. Captain Beaufort approved of the suggestion and wrote to Professor Peacock of Cambridge, who consulted with a friend, Professor Henslow. He named Mr. Charles Darwin, grandson of Dr. Darwin the poet, and a young man of promising ability, extremely fond of geology and indeed all branches of natural history. In consequence, an offer was made to Mr. Darwin to be my guest on board, which he accepted conditionally. Permission was obtained for his embarkation, and an order was given by the Admiralty that he should be borne on the ship's books for provisions. The conditions asked by Mr. Darwin were that he should be at liberty to leave the Beagle and retire from the expedition when he thought proper, that he should pay a fair share of the expenses of my table. Now here you are at the Mount. This conversation probably took place in the library on this side of the house. So you get this letter, you read it. You still remember your father asking you if you ever going to make anything of yourself or just be a sporting guy. And so he showed the letter to his father. Now, this is a pretty awesome opportunity. Something that nobody would have thought actually possible. Like today, it would be like if I got a letter saying, we want you to be the chief biologist on a mission to Mars. I'd be like, where did that come from? And so imagine Charles's joy when he went and told his father, hey, look, I got this opportunity. I'd like to go. He didn't go to his father and say, hey, guess what? I'm going on the H.M.S. Beagle. He said, Father, may I go? Because if you wanted to, that's just the way it was respectfully back in the day. And also, if you want to share in the family fortune, you don't make the old man mad. So his father said, I can't think of a more useless time than for a young man to go gallivanting around the world with the British Navy. And Darwin had to go, oh, what do I got to do to make this guy happy? And his father said, if you can find one person whose opinion I respect that thinks you should go on this trip, then I shall grant my permission. Uncle Josh. Uncle Josh and Darwin's father were the best of friends. The two were hunting, cigar, and drinking buddies. Charles went to Uncle Josh and explained his dilemma. Uncle Josh said, go pack. I'll take care of your dad. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to read this to you is this last part. He accepted conditionally. Conditionally, I've got to talk my father into letting me do this thing. And finally he relented and permission was obtained for his embarkation. His father said, I think what you're going to do, if you should go on this thing, you want to be able to leave at any time and make sure you pay your own way. Because if somebody else is paying for your food and lodging, then you're pretty much obligated to them. Whereas if you're paying your own way, you can say, I've had enough of this, I'm going home. And so I think that's what his father suggested. And so he paid his own way. And the famous inn in Shrewsbury was the main hub of transportation from which Darwin left and headed to Portsmouth to meet the Beagle. And along with him went Sims Covington. Sims Covington is described as an assistant and a cabin boy, which is not a very high rank. And he assisted Darwin with collecting, with packing, and packing specimens. And he was a very valuable right-hand man for Charles. This is a model of the H.M.S. Beagle at Charles' adulthood home. It's a small boat, a brig of had only 10 guns. They took most of them off because they weren't expecting trouble. I think they kept 4. And at his adult house, called the down house, is this recreation of his cabin where he slept. This was the captain's day cabin. So by day, the captain would meet with his officers down here. They'd put the charts out here. The captain was also a very scientific man and a very good navigator. And when it was time for Charles to sleep, he would bunk up here. Small boat, cramped quarters, maybe 100 men living on it. So that's a nice little boat there. There's a picture. That model is in the Natural History Museum at Oxford. Now, I wanted to get an idea of trying to get in Darwin's head. What was it like to be on a British naval vessel back in those days? The Beagle was scrapped in the late 1800s, and so it no longer exists for us. But there is a British naval vessel that was contemporary with the Beagle called the H.M.S. Victory, and it's now a museum at the Historic Dockyards in Portsmouth. And it's a very famous ship. This was the flagship of Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. And it's a magnificent first-rate ship of the line, which means it carried over 100 cannons and 800 men. So also, I got to say that I've been a big fan of British naval history my whole life. Think Horatio Hornblower books. And so I managed to figure out how to get paid to go visit this place. And it's gigantic. This is the stern, the back for you landlubbers. And look how big it is. These are people. And it has 3 decks on it. This is the front. Not a really great picture there. This is a picture of the middle gun deck. And there's a walking tour, audio walking tour, where you come in and you scan a QR code and it'll tell you something about what's going on in that particular part of the ship. And having experienced dozens and dozens of British naval engagements in my head through the reading of books, I just sat here for a while and just thought about that. It was really a very special place to be. But it is very cramped, and you can imagine that 800 people running around on this boat was very crowded. Even if you were Lord Nelson, this was Lord Nelson's bunk. Just a regular old hammock. One of the things that's amazed me is, like, why would you build a warship with all these ornate glass windows? And why would you take it someplace where they were going to just beat it to shreds? Well, that's just what they did. And they'd fix it when whatever battle damage they had. On his way, when they got ready to leave, Fitzroy gave Charles Darwin a copy of the book Principles of Geology, written by Charles Lyell. At that point, Darwin hadn't met Lyell. Later on, they became fast friends. And one of the leading ideas at the time was what we see in our natural world today, geologically, is a result of many catastrophes in order to shape things like canyons. And there was an Englishman who'd come up with the idea of uniformitarianism, where he was watching a stream and watching a pebble roll down the stream, and he thought, we can explain what we see in our world by what the geologic processes going on today if they had operated for an immense amount of time. And Lyell wrote the first textbook to incorporate the concept of a vast geologic time. And Darwin read the book. Lyell made 2 more editions of that book and sent it to Darwin along the way on his cruise. And they met and became fast friends as soon as Darwin got back. Lyell is also interred at Westminster Abbey, right very close to where Darwin lays. So they finally they leave England. They sail down to the South American coast. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy got along pretty well. Fitzroy had a bad temper, and one time told Darwin, "Well, we can't live together anymore." And then by that evening, he had calmed down. But sometimes maybe the crew got a little overpunished, shall we say? And Darwin was very seasick. The sailing on the boat didn't suit well with him. So as soon as they got to the South American coast, Darwin and Covington got off the boat. And out of the 5 years that they were on the cruise, Darwin spent about 3 of them on land. And as the Beagle was making its way down the coast, making maps, Darwin and Covington were working their way down the coast and collecting specimens. Now, they weren't isolated. They were British naval and merchant vessels all over the place. And so Darwin would cart up specimens he was collecting. He would take his notes. He would pay extra and have it sent by the best, most reliable methods back to England. So Darwin is becoming famous back in England while he's still on his trip. He's sending stuff back to Cambridge, and people are opening up the boxes like it's Christmas. They come around the southern tip. They start coming up the western South America, and Darwin was amazed at the mountains. What he had looked when they went past the mouth of the Amazon, he said it looked like this coast of the South America is subsiding. It was sinking a little bit. When he got around to the west coast and he could see the Andes Mountains, he thought, wow, this side of the continent is rising. And while they were at a place called Valparaiso, which is right about here, there was a magnitude 8 or 8.5, very large earthquake that took place 300 miles north at a place called Concepcion. And Darwin could feel the shaking from where he was. He said, well, something's going on here. He had experienced an earthquake a little earlier that was not that severe, and he also managed to witness a volcanic eruption, something I've never witnessed, but I really would like to. And when they got to Concepcion, they found that the town had been destroyed by a tsunami. It was terrible what he saw there. But in talking with the locals, they told him that, hey, you see those rocks over there? Said, yeah, he said, before the earthquake, those rocks were about 8 feet underwater. And then the earthquake happened, and now they're above water. And Darwin had been up in the mountains at 12,000 feet. He found evidence of marine life, shells, starfish, that were clearly had risen and lived in the ocean. And so imagine he's standing up there, he's looking, how did that get up there from down here? And then he sees this happening, and he thinks about Lyell and geologic time and says, you know, if this had been happening for a really, really long time, maybe these seashells could be transported that high. And so that gave him an actual appreciation of geologic time and how things could change. And also another example of fortuna. He was lucky to have been there at the right place at the right time to witness this. Then he goes to the Galapagos Islands. They're famous for their turtles and the marine lizards and beautiful islands. People ask me, if you're studying Darwin, didn't you go there? I was like, well, you know, there's a limit to what I know how to put on my credit card here. It's on the other side of the world from England. One of the things he noted was, amongst the things he noted was the birds. There was a group of finches, which he described as being obviously related to finches. He was big into birds too, from the mainland. And the Galapagos are about 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador. And he said that you can tell that the flora and fauna are clearly related to the continent, but they're different. And he looked at these finches, which were their bodies all just about the same, except for the beaks. And that the beaks were adapted for different things. Like there was a very stout beak. This bird would eat very big and tough to crack seeds. There was insects that had beaks adapted for nabbing insects. And so he thought to himself, well, I wonder if these are all descendant from a group of finches that maybe were blown here in a storm, and over the years they had been modified. And another thing that fascinated him was there's 10 main islands there, and he could show a specimen to somebody and they could tell him which island it came from. So that they were kind of specialized, so that he said, okay, not only did they get here and specialize for different habitats, but the habitat on each individual island had an effect. And so Darwin's finches, now the wheels are turning in his head. Next. What happened? There we go. There we are. So they get back on the boat, go over to the Galapagos Islands. They start heading west again. Another mission that the Beagle had for this portion of the cruise was to investigate coral islands. We would call it an atoll. Once again, for military purposes. If you can find and identify where there's a safe harbor, you can go hide there, maybe, you know, wait out a storm. It's a long cruise from the Galapagos to Tahiti. They were hoping to get some food and water when they got there, but they were greeted by cannibals, so they didn't stay long. And so here's what Darwin came up with, and this was his first major contribution to science in the 1830s, of the origin of a coral atoll. He realized that if there was a big volcano that put a lot of pressure on the seafloor, that the seafloor would subside, it would sink. It would sink slowly. And at first there would be a coral reef fringing around the outside of the volcano, but as it sunk and the land was farther away, the coral would stay and start forming a little ring with a little tiny mountainlet in there. And eventually, through erosion and further subsidence, you'd end up with just the ring of coral. And oftentimes there's a safe harbor in there. And here's a picture of one. Imagine that you've got a naval vessel, and you can, well, I'll go in here, and the big waves would crash on the beaches and the coral, and but you'd be safe in your little harbor. Fitzroy realized the importance of Darwin's work and was very accommodating. They would plan together, and Darwin would say, "I need to go to this island," and Fitzroy would take him there and drop him off, and then Fitzroy would take the boat and go do something else. And Charles was put in charge of this mission, trying to figure out the coral reefs. Now, Darwin's famous work, The Origin of Species, came out in 1859. And these are just a select few topics of what he published before then in the late 1830s and 40s and early 50s. So by the time Darwin came back from his trip, he was already famous. He had sent tons and tons of letters, papers, specimens back to England. And so such interesting things as geological notes on the coast of South America, the elevation of the coast of Chile and how it was being pushed up through earthquakes. He had to throw in here a rock seen in an iceberg. And his first, like I said, his first publication on the structure and distribution of coral reefs started making Darwin really famous. And so that part of the story gets lost in translation. That Darwin was already a celebrity scientist long before he published his major work. 2 years after coming back off the Beagle cruise, he read a paper by Thomas Malthus, author of the essay on populations. And Malthus, a Malthusian theory, was described toward human populations, and there was some really serious scientific problems with what he wrote. But the nature, the argument that it impressed on Darwin was important. Malthus said that human populations grow far faster than the food supply, which turns out not to be true, and that human populations were going to be limited eventually by things like famine, disease, and war. And Darwin took that and came up with the idea of the struggle for existence, that many more organisms are born in the natural world than could possibly survive. And it was going to make resources limited, resources being someplace to live, something to eat, a mate, and that there was going to be competition for these resources, and that some were going to win and some were going to lose. And in the scientific biological world, that means the losers don't do so well, and the winners are the ones who make the next population. And that some of these there would be favorable traits, like go back to the beaks of his finches, favorable traits that would allow an organism to have advantage in a particular area. Though that advantage was going to translate to success, and offspring with favorable traits would pass those favorable traits onto their offspring, and those favorable traits would accumulate later generations. And so Darwin described this as a light going on in his head. Also, a little bit later, another guy had a similar light go off in his head, a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who will come up in conversation here in a minute. Darwin decided it was time to settle down and get married. He made a list of positives and negatives about being married, like analyzing it. And in the course of making his list, he realized he didn't want to live and grow old by himself. And so, yes, marriage was necessity. So now he had to find a wife, and he went to his uncle Josiah. And anyway, Emma, his wife, was his first cousin, Josiah's daughter. And that led to some issues with their children. They had 10 children, and 7 of them survived to adulthood, which is a pretty good percentage for back then. And they had a happy marriage. Back then, you got married out of a matter of practicality, and often it wasn't about love. And sometimes that would come later, and sometimes it wouldn't. In the Darwin's case, they fell deeply in love and had a long lasting marriage, which is interesting because she was pretty religious and he was not. But that was the only source of conflict they really had. Now I might add that I'm happily married myself. Here's a picture of my wife and I. at the Natural History Museum in Oxford. Shout out to my wife, Penny. I got to tell you, this whole time I was over there, she was very supportive. She was very supportive of my proposal. She was very supportive of me going, realizing that it was going to cost a lot of money in several different ways. I wasn't going to be able to get my usual overload of classes, and I was going to be spending all the money over there. She never wavered in her support. Thank you. So I go to search out where Darwin lived, and I took I took a underground. That's the subway in London. To Victoria Station, and I got on a train and took it to a place called South Bromley, and I got off of that train and took a bus to Down, and it dropped me off right here. Here's a bus stop, and you can see it's another day I was wearing my TCC raincoat, and I walked up to, and I'll show you a picture from the other side of the street. It looks just pretty much the same. That was part of my about a half a mile walk up to the Down house. Very pretty. And there it is. And he built this house. I was very shocked at how similar it was to the Mount, the house where he grew up in. It was the almost exact same layout, gardens. He had himself a walk was called the Sand Walk over here on the left. He would go out and he would do laps while he was thinking. And he said he set out to do so many laps, and he would take a stone and put it out there to help him keep track. And his children, being mischievous as they were, would mess with him. Sometimes they would take a stone away and make him walk more. Sometimes they'd add a couple to make him think what happened. But he enjoyed his children. And back in that day, in that strata of society, fathers weren't always intimately emotional support of their children, but Charles very definitely was. So much so that when one was sick, the sick child would take all the priority and could lie on the couch with a blanket as long as they wanted. That's part of his walk. It was just pictures, of course, don't do the justice to the beauty of the area. And it's the Down house has been restored to its former glory. And it's now a museum. They said no pictures inside the house. You might recall I might have already showed you one. I thought to myself, this is a nice recreation of Darwin's cabin. I didn't come all this way not to get a picture, so they could yell at me if they want, but I didn't get caught. Going back into town, this is a picture from the bus stop looking across the street. And the people at the Down house had told me that this was Charles's home pub. In England, you have a home pub, your regular, and this was it. And so Darwin would go in there and he would hang out with his friends and have a beer. And so I just went inside, that's all. Now, Darwin has done all of this stuff. He's been working on his theory of natural selection in a variety of ways for 20 years. Everybody knew it. He was already the famous scientist, naturalist in England. And he gets a letter from this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a collector of specimens in the Western Pacific, in Malaysia, in that area. And he would send them back to England and sell them. And in his journeys, he read about Malthus, and he came across some similar ideas to Darwin, and he wrote a letter to Darwin and said, hey, I'm outlining my theory, and what do you think? What should I do with this? And Darwin he had been prompted by his friends. You need to write this down. You need to publish this. Somebody's going to come and preempt you. You need to do this. And Darwin was reluctant. Why was he reluctant? Why did he delay? Well, one of the things was the memory of in his family of the Priestley affair. He really had nightmares about the villagers coming after him with pitchforks and torches and burning him at the stake for heresy, which was a real legitimate issue. Not as much in 1850s as it was in the 1700s, but it was still there. Another thing is that he wanted to document in every detail possible his argument. And every time he got ready to think his work was over, he would come up with another idea, another piece of evidence that he could put in his book. And he was planning on writing a book that was really thick. But Darwin's friends, especially Lyell, had been saying, you need to do this, and you need to publish it. And then so Darwin takes this letter from Russell Wallace and says, it happened, my worst fears. And Lyell probably said, I told you so, or maybe he didn't. But Lyell said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to, me, you, we're going to present a letter that you wrote to Asa Gray at Harvard years earlier, outlining some of his theories, some of the other letters that you sent, and we're going to, and Alfred Russel Wallace's. We'll present all three of them at the same time to the Linnaean Society in London. Well, the Linnaean Society is a pretty top-notch organization, and there might be somebody in this room who's published with the Linnaean Society. And everybody, and actually, it didn't really attract much attention. Nobody really said anything. Charles publishes his book in 1859. It took him 10 months to write out. And one of the things about Darwin and why he built his house out and down, isolated, was he liked people, but he wanted to be able to control who came in and out. And by living out in what was then the boondocks, he could have people over for social activities or not. He also suffered from a variety of illnesses, which are not really well understood. Some people suggest he got a tropical disease, maybe Chagas disease, from an insect bite while he was in the tropics. Chagas disease is a real thing. It's in Texas, as far north as San Antonio, at least, which is described as having shivers, heart palpitations, flatulence, and fatigue. And I thought, well, maybe he's just getting older. But he would have these bouts of illness, but he could also put it aside when he needed to. So it's also pretty strongly suggested and accepted that maybe this was psychosomatic kind of illness. Either way, he was able to put that aside. He had very few bouts of that while he was writing The Origin, and he published it. He had to pay money to publish it himself. You had to go through the first pay to have the first edition published, and if it's sold, then maybe the publisher would print some more for you. Before he published this, he had put some money in his will specifically for the publication and asked Emma, upon my passing, would you please publish my book? And she said, no, do it now. And so good for her. So the book comes out. It's an instant hit. The first run of 1,500 copies is sold on the very first day. 500 of them by a very well-known bookseller. So immediately they go through another run of 3,000. It was a big best-selling hit. Darwin made about the most he ever made off of anything, and really not that much. I think 10,000 pounds, which is their equivalent of dollars. But Darwin didn't need for money. When Darwin and Emma got married, one of the gifts that Charles's father and father-in-law, Uncle Joe's, gave to them was an endowment of what today would be $1.2 million, and their income from that $80,000 a year. So Darwin, unlike us, never really had to worry about money, and we're going to see that's another common theme of my three folks. The rest of us, we don't know what that's like. We have to worry about money, don't we? I fear my next electric bill after the cold snap we just had. So the book comes out. There's some people that are in support. There's some people obviously against it. And this is the Museum of Natural History at Oxford, where there was a great debate. I came around the corner and saw this, and I walked up to it. I went back to the corner and took this picture. This was very awe-inspiring. A beautiful building. And this is the main hall, which was packed for a debate on Darwin's book and natural selection. Now it's filled with all kinds of specimens. It's really a cool place. And the picture I showed you earlier of the opening slide of me and the statue, that's back there, right about there along the back wall. Well, uh, Darwin was ill and he couldn't come to the debate. How convenient, huh? Another piece of evidence that maybe it was psychosomatic. So in his place was a guy known as Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. He was going to support Darwin, and there was going to be this debate, and the debate was going to be against the local bishop, Samuel Wilberforce. And actually, it wasn't really well planned. The day before, neither one of them had planned to be there, but they heard about it, and Huxley was going to leave, and he said, "Oh, I think I'll hang around for that." And debating amongst gentlemen back in the day was also a sport, so they were both looking. They were itching for a fight. Wilberforce has his interesting family. His great grandfather was in the British Parliament who introduced the first law banning the slave trade. So the Wilberforce family was very much abolitionists, and so was Darwin, off to the side. So anyway, they have this great debate, and it's going back and forth, and it's standing room only in that big, huge main gallery at the museum, which had just opened up. It was their first major event. And now there's no actual transcript of the debate, so we have to rely on what people that were there said later. Evidently, Wilberforce stood up and looked at Huxley and said, "So, can you tell me on which side of your family you're descended from an ape? Would it be your grandmother or your grandfather?" And Huxley said something along the lines of, "Well, I would much rather be descendant from an ape than have a brain and use it to squash scientific debate." And it was like, bam, mic drop moment, off they walked. They went off and told their friends. They both felt like they won. But the general consensus is that Huxley emerged from that debate victorious. So now we've seen a couple of things. There's a picture of Darwin as a young man when he would be getting ready to go off to Cambridge. Then middle age when he was working as a scientist and on his own pay. And later on, I don't know how old he is there, but I don't know, maybe 40, 45, 50. And then, of course, he lived to be 71 years old. And so here he is in a later age. And like what awaits all of us is the inevitable. He's interred at Westminster Abbey, which is a beautiful building. If you ever get to London, you need to go there. The who's who of who's buried there is just unbelievable. And there, of course, is the first time I was there with some esteemed company. I was looking around for Darwin's grave, and there it is on the floor. I had to wait for people to get away from it so I wouldn't have their feet in the picture. And of course, they don't want you to take pictures at Westminster Abbey either, but, you know, I'm a rebel. What can I say? So I sat there actually the very first time I was there in 2017. I already had contemplated sitting there thinking about, wow. And I went back there. I actually went there. It was the first place I went to as soon as I arrived in London. And I sat there and thought about Darwin and everything that I was going to learn. I had done as much research as I could before I left. I didn't want to learn anything over there that I could have learned here. I wanted to build on what I learned here. So I read everything. I listened to audiobooks about his biography, his autobiography. And so when I was in London, I was in a good position to sit there and contemplate what I had learned about his life. And it was quite the experience. And this is a statue. I didn't get a picture of me with this statue. This is in the Natural History Museum in London. And so now I've told you stories about what it was Darwin saw that helped him come up with his theory of natural selection. And it starts out long before he was born. He was born into a family where the idea of evolution was okay to talk about. He was born into a wealthy family, so he never had to worry about money. He was lucky in some of the experiences he had on the cruise. He was lucky with the wife that he had that was very supportive. He was lucky to have friends that stuck up for him in a pinch. And I think one of the main things is he never actually had to work a day in his life. One of the things that we'll see with my three scientists is that all three of them had that in common. Andreas Vesalius, the father of anatomy, his father was physician to the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. So he was wealthy and didn't have to work either. Gregor Mendel took a different approach when he was born in the Czech Republic to a poor family, poor farmer family, and you had to pay for school. There was no free K through 12 back then. And when his school money ran out, one of his instructors said, "Hey, I know a guy," and so he joined a monastery, and didn't have to worry about money there either. And the thought there is that that frees your mind to open up to bigger possibilities, and contemplate the larger things in life than what your electric bill is going to be, or, you know, when did a can of mushrooms at Walmart go from 88 cents to $1.50? And I think that played a big, huge role in what he discovered. So Charles Darwin discovered the what and why of evolution. He discovered the what was natural selection by having the favorable adaptations accumulate in generations. He discovered the why. The why is for survival. In changing environments, if the population doesn't change, they'll go extinct. So he discovered the what, natural selection, and why, the survival. But what he missed was the how. How do these favorable traits go from one generation to the next generation? The inheritance. And that's going to be the topic of my next talk, which is March 28th, the life and times of Gregor Mendel. They were contemporaries. Mendel is just a little bit younger than Darwin, and Mendel worked out the theories of inheritance, but they never met. And Mendel even traveled to London one time, but they never met. And Darwin never heard about Mendel's theories of inheritance, which would have explained exactly how these favorable traits get passed down and accumulate in further generations. So on May 28th, a little over a month, I'll talk about Mendel, and I'll explain to you how he came up with the how of genetics. So what was it about Mendel's life? And that, hopefully another interesting story. And do we have any questions? No questions. Any questions from the audience? No, they were dissected and preserved. Um, I don't know how, today they probably use formaldehyde. Today we use alcohol, but like the birds and mammals and such, they would have been dissected and cleaned out and stuffed. And that's one of the things Covington was really good at. And then Darwin would choose who he sent them to. He would say, if you had most favored status, you would get the good stuff. They're both at Cambridge and Oxford, but some of them are on display, but most of them are back in the archives. It's all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, folks online. Thank you, folks here today. Appreciate you coming. And